All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to zero in on that critical moment right after World War II, the moment that basically set the stage for the next 50 years of world history. We're talking about a huge shift in American foreign policy that drew the battle lines for the Cold War. And hey, if you're revising for IGCSE history, this is a big one, so you'll definitely want to pay close attention. So here's the central mystery we're trying to solve. How on earth did the USA and the Soviet Union go from fighting on the same team against the Nazis to becoming these bitter global rivals? It's a huge question, and the answer, well, it all starts in the rubble of a devastated continent. Okay, here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to see just how chaotic and broken post-war Europe really was. Then we'll zoom in on a crisis in Greece that basically forced America's hand. After that, we'll unpack the two-part American response. It involves a new doctrine and a lot of dollars. Then, and this is key, we'll look at how the Soviets saw these exact same events. Finally, we'll see how it all came together to slam the door shut, dividing Europe for decades. So, let's set the scene. The war is officially over, but for millions and millions of people, the suffering was far from it. You have to picture a continent that is just on its knees. This created a massive power vacuum and left everyone desperately searching for answers. And you can see how all these problems are just tangled together, right? Your cities are destroyed, which means your economies have collapsed. People are starving, homeless, completely desperate. To a lot of them, the old systems looked totally broken. And when you're in that situation, communism, with its promise of equality and taking care of everyone, well, it starts to sound like a pretty good idea. And that possibility is what started setting off alarm bells in Washington. So, all that fear floating around Europe needed a spark, a single event to really force a reaction. And that spark came from a civil war that was raging in the small, but as it turns out, very important nation of Greece. Let's just walk through this for a second. For a couple of years, Great Britain, the old world power, had been funding the Greek monarchy in their fight against a communist uprising. But then, look at that last point, February 1947. Britain, totally exhausted and flat broke from World War II, basically throws its hands up and says, "We're done. We can't afford this anymore." All of a sudden, it looked like Greece was about to become the next communist country. And this moment, it's about so much more than just Greece. This is a massive shift in who runs the world. The old British Empire was fading away. If the West wanted to stop what they saw as a communist takeover, there was really only one country left with the money and the muscle to do it: the United States. The torch was being passed, and the ball was now firmly in America's court. So, the pressure's on America. How do they respond? Well, they came up with a really powerful 1-2 punch: a brand new foreign policy idea and a massive pile of cash to make it a reality. And this brings us to the key term you have to know from this period: containment. Now, this was a radical change for America. For most of its history, the U.S. had an isolationist streak. It tried to stay out of Europe's problems. Containment was the total opposite. It was a new promise to get involved anywhere in the world to stop communism from spreading. This new policy gets its name in March 1947. It becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. President Truman goes to Congress and pretty much declares a global showdown between democracy and communism. This was the political side of containment, a clear line drawn in the sand. But words are one thing, action is another. A few months later, General George Marshall comes up with the economic half of the plan. He did the math and figured out that to rebuild Europe and make it strong enough to say no to communism, it would take a jaw-dropping amount of money: $17 billion. And this, of course, became the famous Marshall Plan. The logic was actually pretty simple. Hungry, desperate people might turn to communism, but people who are prosperous, who have jobs and a stable economy, probably not. The idea was to rebuild Europe's economies, create strong allies, and, not coincidentally, new customers for American goods. But of course, Washington's version of events was not Moscow's version of events. They saw the exact same things in completely different ways. And to really understand the Cold War, you absolutely have to grasp both perspectives. This right here is so important. Look at it from Truman's shoes. Stalin is an aggressive dictator, breaking promises left and right and taking over Eastern Europe. But now, put yourself in Stalin's shoes. The Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany twice in 30 years. He was terrified of it happening a third time. For him, controlling Eastern Europe wasn't about aggression. It was about creating a defensive safety barrier, a buffer zone. And that Marshall Plan? Yeah, the Soviets were deeply suspicious. They did not see it as a generous gift. They called it dollar imperialism. They believed it was just America's way of buying control of Europe, making other countries dependent on American money. Stalin actually forbade any of the countries in his sphere of influence from taking a single dollar. And to be fair, the Soviets kind of had a point. The Marshall Plan wasn't purely about helping people. It was also smart strategy. A rebuild Europe meant brand new markets for American factories, which would keep the U.S. economy humming and prevent another Great Depression. It was a way to secure American prosperity and stop communism, all at the same time. So you've got these two sides staring each other down, totally mistrustful of one another. But the final event, the thing that really cemented this division and pushed the Marshall Plan over the finish line, happened in early 1948. Believe it or not, back in the States, the Marshall Plan was in trouble. That $17 billion price tag was making a lot of politicians in Congress really nervous. They were hesitating, delaying the vote. The entire plan was seriously at risk of failing. And then came the shockwave. In March 1948, communists seized total control of Czechoslovakia. Now, this was different. Czechoslovakia had been a democracy. To the West, this wasn't Stalin securing a buffer zone. This looked like clear-cut, aggressive expansion. It was proof that communism was on the march. The takeover of Czechoslovakia ended the debate. All that hesitation in the U.S. Congress just evaporated. They were so alarmed they rushed to approve the money. Just 1 month later, President Truman signed the Marshall Plan into law. It's ironic, really. Stalin's power play totally backfired and guaranteed that his enemy's plan would succeed. And the consequences came thick and fast. With American money pouring in, the Greek government won its civil war. Stalin tightened his grip on Eastern Europe, creating his own rival economic bloc. Just like that, the continent was split in two. That phrase Winston Churchill used, the Iron Curtain, wasn't just a metaphor anymore, it was a hard reality. The Cold War had officially begun. Which leads us to our final big question. When you look at all the pieces, the devastation in Europe, Truman's perspective, Stalin's perspective, was the United States justified in stepping in so forcefully? Was this a necessary defensive freedom, or was it an aggressive move to expand American power and influence? That's a tough one, and it's definitely something for you to think about.